mechanisms for measuring them, so that accepting we have limitations and ultimately try to improve that. There's a lot of information that's being asked. How is the data being used and standardized and compared in mind? So there's this question around how is this data that's reported from manufacturing being used? And then ultimately trying to align and share across the manufacturing community so that at least at that level, there's an alignment on how you measure environmental impact across the life cycle of medicines. So then the next slide really indicates to me that actually there is an agreement to progress and share this information across the ecosystem. So the work together by stakeholder groups coming together through an independent body. A number of people have then nominated BSI to actually be that independent body working between healthcare systems and the manufacturers to come together to really align on what is the standard for measuring environmental impact of medicines through life cycle assessments using product category rules. Hence the development of this standard. Really, that's the two different perspectives coming together, agreeing to progress in an aligned way and develop a consensus-based standard. And that's the role that we BSI are serving here. So Flora, if I can maybe turn it over to you now to go through, after we talk about the different types of stakeholders that we've engaged through this process, go through some elements of the standard. I think really the key part I just want to mention here is that there are a huge number of stakeholders that are engaged in this process, both from a geographical presence, so representatives from every region in the key markets for pharmaceutical manufacturing and also care delivery, but also the different types of actors within this ecosystem. So we have NGO and aid organizations, we have trade bodies, we have regulators, we have supranational bodies, we have academics, healthcare system procurers, members of the supply chain, and governments, all feeding into the development of this standard. So it very much is a consensus-based standard as a representative of the entire healthcare and life sciences ecosystem. So we really are progressing together in this development. Laura, over to you now.
Thanks, Courtney. So really quickly, the structure of the team that's working on this standard, as you can see on the slide, we were initially sponsored by the NHS England, the UK Office for Life Sciences, and the Pharma LCA Consortium, which is a consortium made up of currently 9 global pharmaceutical companies. So even within that team, it shows a real breadth of interests and activities. As sponsors, they have a role in kind of ensuring that we at BSI uphold a fair process. And then we engage technical authors and the steering group who advise on the standard. And I'll talk you through that process in a second, but just to summarize, really our goal here is to help the bodies working across the ecosystem to facilitate greener procurement decisions, to guide sustainable manufacturing practices, to improve the efficiency of their supply chains, and to accelerate industry-wide improvements in the same way that we've seen standardization for life cycle analysis work in a wide variety of other industries. And I think for us in the standards development process, that's been really helpful, is seeing the way those standards work. So, really we've been looking at the ISO standards for life cycle analysis and seeing how effective those have been and building on those principles and learnings with this particular project. So PAS 2090 is a standard in development which establishes the common methodology for environmental assessment in pharmaceutical manufacturing. All the principles that are listed here you've seen before. A PAS is a sponsored standard which is developed rapidly, or more rapidly than a British standard. So that's the standard with the BS acronym that you might see, but it does go through the same governance and the same robust processes which have been driving UK standardization for over 100 years. And we build on our standards expertise by bringing in a lot of stakeholders from the outside, as you guys have seen. And with this being a global standard, really our purpose as standards developers is not to create a standard that fits one geography or one ecosystem or one use case. We want to make sure that in this process, we're really focusing on creating something ambitious and robust in a technical way that can be implemented. And so BSI therefore is kind of agnostic to the usage or how it might be used, and we trust that those conversations will be had appropriately through other channels. So really, we're looking at the exact scope of the standard and not how it might be used down the line. But we're really, really looking forward to seeing that impact that it will have. In terms of the scope, I'm going to show you two parts of the scope, but you can see the whole scope on the hub, and you probably will have seen it if you were looking at our discussion forums. So the part that I've left out is just the things that are out of scope. So you can have a look at that for yourselves. But the PAS specifies requirements, which basically means that you can comply with the whole standard, and then there will be some additional informative text here and there that provides context or explanations. You can see there all of the different aspects of the process that it covers. So primary data requirements and secondary data selection, that's been really interesting for us. I'm just going to pull a few things out from this, but one useful thing to note, I think, is that you can comply with this standard in theory in both the cradle to gate or cradle to grave stages. So there are elements where the way in which you use or comply with the standard will be decided in different ways by different decision makers across the supply chain, potentially depending on the maturity of your project, the relevance of the product in the portfolio, the maturity of the users in applying this PAS across their portfolio. So who is the standard for? Well, as per the scope, it's intended primarily for use by those carrying out, assessing, and reviewing environmental LCAs of pharmaceutical products, including the determination of related greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other environmental impacts. And those other environmental impacts are a really interesting topic for us at the moment as part of the standards development process. So it might be of interest to a huge variety of stakeholders across the ecosystem. And today we are primarily focusing on sort of departments of health and government bodies. But we recognize that a huge variety of stakeholders may be interested in the PAS, and we are going to host similar sessions for a number of those stakeholder types. I'm just going to move on to the process. You can see here some rough timelines, which are intended to be indicative. So we're currently at the second steering group review. This basically means that the PAS has been drafted and redrafted. So the initial draft was submitted to us in October last year. It was looked at by the steering group who submitted comments. As a result, it's been updated in response to the agreed resolutions of those comments. So it's already gone through one review cycle. And now the updated PAS, which has been changed to reflect the consensus reached by the steering group, is with the steering group again for their review and their validation that the changes that have been made are appropriate and in line with their objectives. So we're currently awaiting some of that feedback from the steering group, but I'm really excited to see how the group responds to the changes that have been made. We will then go into some meetings to discuss any further comments that the steering group have on the PAS. Then it will be redrafted in line with any additional changes that are agreed upon, and then it will come out to all of you for public consultation. So we're anticipating that public consultation will happen in May this year. I'm really, really hopeful that as many of you as possible will prepare for that public consultation. We'll start to speak about the PAS within your networks and to your colleagues. When public consultation goes live, everyone who is registered on the hub will be contacted. You can also email me directly to make sure that I get in touch with you, and I'll leave my details shortly. The public consultation will last for 4 weeks. It'll be held online. Comments are submitted virtually. Ideally, they will be submitted by an individual on behalf of an organization, just to make sure that, if there are multiple people within your organization, you've sat down and talked through what your organization wants to comment, just to reduce the risk of duplication. So that 4-week public consultation is a really pivotal point for us because we get to sense check what we have discussed with the steering group within a broader group of people. But because we have steering group members representing all areas of industry, we hope that those interests will have been represented adequately. So it's a really exciting time for us, and we will be in touch at that point. And very much encourage all of you to keep an eye out for the beginning of public consultation. All the comments that are submitted at public consultation will be discussed by the steering group. We are bound by our processes to make sure that each one is discussed and our resolutions are appropriately recorded. So those meetings will take place in June, and then the redrafting will take place in July. Our intention is to publish the standard then in October. And once it's published, everyone who commented at public consultation will be notified, and it will be made available on the BSI shop, and you'll be made aware through the hub. So we're really looking forward to that point. Everything that you've heard from me about the standard has been kind of general. So I know that you might be very curious about what's in it. I can say very little in detail because I'm not a technical expert, but it does align with the ISO 14044 series. It covers multiple environmental impact categories. That's an interesting point for us that we'll bring up later. Just making sure that we require the reporting and the recording of categories that are useful to everyone across the global ecosystems we're talking about. It sets a set of core minimal requirements, and then there will be additional sort of recommendations for other activities to reach that gold standard. So we have a sort of two-tier approach of the basics, and then those additional activities that bring you up a level in terms of the quality of your output. If you have any more detailed technical questions, you can definitely ask them here, but we may not have time to get to them today, but we will try and bring those forward and get an answer to you through the hub. So the steering group, as you've seen, plays a really significant role in reviewing the standard. All the sponsors have a representative on the steering group, and then we've got steering group members from lots of areas of industry, including academia, consultancy, etc., and of course manufacturers. So my role is just to make sure that we have an unbiased facilitator for these meetings, and that we reach consensus successfully. And it can be a challenge, but it's been a really rewarding experience working with this steering group, especially when the PAS is going to have such an amazing impact. So I'm going to hand over to Nicholas to talk about OLS's involvement and their aims and objectives. Thanks.
Thanks. This will be very quick from me, as generally speaking, this is very much part of some of the work that OLS does and government does more broadly around reaching net zero, which the UK has a legislated commitment to. And that, you can see the definition on screen there, so I'm not going to cover it exactly, but we very much understand that achieving net zero will be an economy-wide, a full societal effort, and it will require very much working in partnership with businesses, industry, academia, society to reduce carbon emissions. And the life sciences sector and the healthcare sector more broadly will be a part of that. Emissions from the healthcare sector represent approximately 5% of global emissions. Obviously, the breakdown within that is very complicated, and some parts contribute more than others. But we very much see this as a way to help businesses understand and manufacturers understand the impact that they are having. It's a tool in their playbook to help reach net zero. And I'll pass over to Peter to talk about how it impacts upon the NHS.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Nick. So I'm Peter Morgan, Head of Medicines Net Zero for NHS England. So now that we understand the UK government's commitments, I'll give you a really quick overview of what that means for the NHS and our approach as we move forward. So in October 2020, the NHS became the world's first health service to commit to reaching carbon net zero, recognising the growing threat climate change possesses to health. The Delivering a Net Zero report outlines how we will achieve this ambition. So targets of net zero by 2040 for the emissions that we directly control, So that's the NHS carbon footprint, the white box on the chart on the right there, and net zero by 2045 for all the emissions we can influence, the NHS carbon footprint plus. So that's that whole diagram encompassing all of our emissions. But additionally, the Health and Care Act 2022 introduced new legal duties on NHS England, on trusts, foundation trusts and integrated care boards to contribute to statutory emissions and environmental targets. Now, as Nick said, the NHS accounts for around 5% of the UK's carbon emissions, with medicines responsible for about 25% of those. So they sit both in the NHS carbon footprint. So on the left-hand side of the chart, with metered dose inhalers and anaesthetic gases, that makes up about 5% of our emissions. And then the NHS carbon footprint plus, so that's in the manufacture and supply of all other medicines, and that sits in that right-hand side under the NHS carbon footprint plus. So to decarbonise medicines effectively while maintaining high quality patient care, we must collaborate across industry, health systems, academia, medicines regulators and supply chain, and all of those other stakeholders that Courtney has already mentioned. But working with industry experts, academia and available literature, we have some understanding of medicines or medicine-related processes that contribute more emissions. However, to fully characterise emissions, we need greater transparency and a more consistent climate change impact assessments. A simple common standard would enable consistent measurement, reporting and comparison, guiding targeted actions and innovations. The BSI's consensus-driven process aligns with our commitments by bringing together experts across sectors to develop a rigorous, widely consulted standard. Aligning this standard with other recognised frameworks, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, will help create a unified approach to environmental impact measurement. That's all from me. And back to Courtney, I think.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Nicholas. I think if we could hear from Scott, who I know is representing the Australian government right now in the absence of Madeline being off sick. So Scott, over to you.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm Scott. I'm an academic at the University of Melbourne. So I'm not an employee of the Australian government, but I have been advising the Australian government. So this presentation isn't from the Australian government, but rather from me, from Australia per se. The Australian government is committed to comprehensive action on climate and health. So at the end of 2023, it released a national health and climate strategy. One of those objectives was health system decarbonisation. So with health system decarbonisation, the government recognises that standards are going to be important. Granular LCAs are going to be important for that decarbonisation, both for resource allocation and to also help decision making, and standards are going to be an important part of that quantification. Focusing on what we're talking about today with PAS 2090. So the Australian government uses health technology assessments and particularly cost effectiveness analysis to inform decisions on what health technologies are going to be funded or subsidised. Last year there was a health technology assessment review, and as part of that they recognised they wanted to investigate options going into the future to start incorporating environmental impacts and particularly carbon into health technology assessments. So in saying that, they recognised that there are many details to be worked out about how to do that, but it would be expected that results that come out from PAS would be included into that. So for the Australian government, that's sort of the immediate sort of viewpoint of where this PAS could be feeding into. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to hand over to Courtney just to talk a little bit about what we're hearing from regulators as well.
Thanks, Laura. Yes, I'm speaking on behalf of MHRA, who unfortunately could not be here today. But MHRA is participating in this development of standards process, and they have given us permission to announce that here, and also the desire from the agency to enable regulation in this space as well. So I think there's a signal of interest in their participation and time and effort to participate in this development, but also looking to understand how this could enable regulation in this space. The MHRA is the Medicines Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency. So that's the UK equivalent of EMA, European Medicines Agency, for example, or FDA in the US. So it's the UK regulator for healthcare products. So yes, their participation is involved in the standards development process. And so I think that's really the perspectives that we've gotten from different groups in this stakeholder group that we're engaging with today. So the healthcare system, payers and procurers, policymakers, ministries of health. If we can hold there, Flora, that's great. So I wanted to talk about how we have been engaging through a digital hub, which if you're not yet members of, I'll ask if Sasha can add a link to the chat for becoming a member of this digital hub to keep informed of this standards development process. We are engaging in these discussion forums over the last 2 to 3 months to really understand the different perspectives from different stakeholder groups. So we had a forum specific to consultants and academics. We had a forum specific to this audience, the Department of Health, Ministries of Health, healthcare system, procurer, payers, and also regulators. We had a forum specific to manufacturers. In fact, we're going to summarize some of the manufacturer feedback in a subsequent webinar on the 24th of February, invite to be sent. We also had a forum for NGO and aid organizations who are helping get access to medicines for low and middle income countries, and also looking at this sustainable procurement challenge. So the purpose of this was to try to really understand the usage, the challenges, and the opportunities that could be used for this standard. Here is a quick screenshot of a couple of the pieces of feedback we got from the discussion forums from this audience, the healthcare system, procurers and payers, as well as regulators. So one stakeholder, and I've removed their name for sensitivity purposes, they said that they could potentially use this to make head-to-head comparisons between 2 or more pharmaceutical products. They could help understand and the deliberations and value judgments of committees who are responsible to recommend or not recommend that product is used in a specific market. It's currently not possible because of product category rules are not in place yet for medicines and environmental impact measurements. So I think there's a real signal here that there's an importance of potentially using this for head-to-head comparisons from one point of view. There's also a signal from same stakeholder group around the different environmental impact categories that are possible, or planetary boundaries, indicating that greenhouse gas emissions and climate change are the most priority focus for them. We had another procurer who indicated that actually they're waiting for the standard to be released in order to embed carbon footprinting of products into their tenders. It's on their roadmap. They have started collecting information about organizational level carbon, but are ultimately waiting for this standard so that they can reference it in tenders for product-specific carbon footprinting requests. I had a regulator mention that currently the standard or the reference to environmental impact and life cycle assessments is not currently used. So some interesting feedback just from this stakeholder group, I would say, of their weight, to see the relevance of the standard, the purpose that they would use the standard for. The next slide also was something that we really took into account when looking at the question, like I mentioned at the beginning. There are all of these environmental considerations when manufacturing or producing medicines, and all of those environmental considerations are difficult to weigh up against each other without product category rules. And so in order for manufacturers to have a consistent way to say, if we reduce carbon here, what does this have to do with toxicity? What does this impact our water use, our resource use? There is a need to understand what are the important environmental categories or planetary boundaries. So here on the left-hand side are the overall results from all the different stakeholder groups that we got feedback from. And you can see some very strong consistency of the top priorities and the overall results with the top priorities of the healthcare systems. So I think that's a really positive alignment point that I want to point out here. Climate change was by far the most important and referenced. Resource use of fossil fuels, again, was another known and acknowledged significant piece there. Water use and ecotoxicity. I know that there's some views from other healthcare system procurers who are really prioritizing that as an environmental criterion. Some of their commercial tenders now is this ecotoxicity of fresh water based on discharge from manufacturing of medicines or through the effluent. Also resource use. Again, I think the question of conservation of resources is a key one that came up in both the overall results as well as the healthcare system priorities. So I think it was just worth planting that back to everyone, because it was a debate in the standards development process of which environmental considerations do we want to set rules for, and how do we do that? And so this is kind of the results, and I think that's played back quite clearly and will be taken into account in the second round of steering group sessions from Flora and the team. If we go to the next slide, it also shows what the manufacturers view and some of the discussion forum comments. So interestingly, again, there was an alignment, I would say, on the top 5 environmental planetary boundaries on the right-hand side that were also attributed to the manufacturers. So you can see that, again, climate change, resource use for fossil fuels, ecotoxicity, resource use for minerals and metals, and water use were all, aligned in the top 5. What was flagged by manufacturers actually was that an additional planetary boundary of land use for biodiversity considerations, and also we're considering the use of bio-based materials or feedstocks. So again, I think that goes into this broader and emerging topic of biodiversity and making sure that land use is maintained and considered when manufacturing the medicines. On the left-hand side are some of the feedback that we got from the manufacturers. Again, I think the real universal part of that feedback was around the unified framework, a finally agreed upon methodology to do life cycle assessments and a set of rules to do that for specific product categories in the medicines arena. And I think that that's really helpful to driving progress for more sustainable medicine development. I think also the fact that this acknowledgement that right now all the manufacturers are doing it differently, and having a consistent and transparent and comparable evaluation of their products can help with this healthy tension that has happened between manufacturers and their customers and the healthcare systems. And then also, I think too that there are some known gaps when doing life cycle assessments currently, and that these product category rules will help really fill those gaps where manufacturers don't have data or don't have rules to apply to certain parts of the life cycle for medicines now. So I think, again, a signal of support generally from the manufacturers. And again, I was really pleased to see the alignment on the top 5 environmental impact categories or planetary boundaries across overall results, the healthcare systems, and also with manufacturers as well. So I think at this stage at Flora, I may hand it over to you to just talk really quickly on the public consultation process, and then we can stop sharing screen and go into a bit of a Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Courtney. And just to thank everyone who's leaving their questions in the chat. We'll kind of come to those as we once we're finished this section. But yeah, to continue your engagement with this standard, obviously keeping an eye on the hub that we've shared in the chat and BSI social media would be a great place to start. The hub already has quite a few resources, including the scope of the standard and some more sort of indicative content that nods to what the standard will contain. If you'd like to be directly contacted at the outset of public consultation, you can email me. As I've said, you won't be added to a marketing list, so don't worry. When public consultation begins, it will be live on BSI's standards development portal platform. And I have a recommended approach there that, really the best kind of contribution you can make is to give us a kind of concrete proposal for what you'd like to see in the standard, what you'd like to see removed or reworded. But I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. If you have any technical questions or anything that you'd like to understand in advance of the public consultation, which, as I said, is expected to begin in May, please do use the hub to further engage with the team. We really want to make the most of that and make sure that you have as much information as you need to participate in the review and to support your colleagues who may be interested in doing so as well. So with that said, I'll hand over to Courtney, who'll kind of moderate this final section, the Q&A. But before I do so, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and for your patience as we set up this call. Courtney.
Thanks, Laura. And maybe we can stop sharing and we can have a bit of a visual interactive session for the last 10 minutes, I think, with the group here, because I think now that we're all on Teams together, we can see people. So I think there's been some good questions here that have come through the chat. I think I'll answered one in the chat, but I'll call it out explicitly. There was a question around what does PAS stand for? PAS meaning publicly available specification. So specification, and Flora, I may ask for you to weigh in here. Specification is very much a very clear set of requirements that you can ultimately measure compliance against. But Flora, if I can ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one because we've actually retired using PAS as an acronym because we now create a broader range of standards than just specifications. So it's one of those things where the acronym takes on a longer life than its original meaning. But yes, this happens to be both a PAS and a specification, which is not always the case. But a specification sets out requirements. So the principal verb of those is shall. In order to claim compliance against the totality of the PAS, you'll have to comply with every single requirement. That does not mean that within the procurement pathways that we've talked about today, that total compliance across the full portfolio will be demanded at the outset of the publication of the PAS. And I think that also touches on another question here, which I'll maybe pass over to Peter to comment on, but is the UK planning on making it mandatory for all suppliers? Obviously, with the caveat that we can't. We don't, that's a whole other conversation that BSI isn't necessarily the right channel for. But Peter, any comments on that?
Great, thanks, Flora. So maybe to kick off with kind of some background and context, there are, within the UK, and I'm sure it's similar to most other health systems here represented, there are a number of different mechanisms or times where we ask for information from our suppliers. That might be at a regulatory stage where we're looking at safety, quality, efficacy. It might be as a health technology assessment, we're looking at cost effectiveness. It might be at procurement stage where we're asking for a minimum standard to be reached and balance that against other things like the safe use of a medicine, its ability to be cured, ongoing supply and costs, but also at the point of prescribing, dispensing, that shared care decision making between patients. So I think there's a number of opportunities by which any environmental impact of a medicine can be introduced, and we're at such an early stage understanding what best mechanisms or best levers are used when we can't be sure on what will be or will have to be used at any other point. But for the NHS, we have the net zero supplier roadmap, and that outlines our ambitions to align with our suppliers from now up until 2030, at least at a high level. And then in April 2028, we have a requirement that we will be asking for product level footprints from our suppliers. Now, we haven't finalised that policy yet. We haven't engaged with our supply chain and our stakeholders to know exactly what that is going to be yet. But what I can say is we're trying to balance that effective use of the public pound, the value that we're getting from our medicines, the supply assurance and resilience to make sure that we're getting the medicines that we can and need to use, as well as delivering the highest, best quality patient care, ensuring that medicines will still be available to use. And we're also aware that meeting standards like these, at least now and for a good few years afterwards, will be difficult. It will require new expertise being drawn into organisations, the setup of new data flows, the understanding of what information is needed and how it needs to be replicated and produced. So we're really keen to engage with our supply chain on this to understand what that could look like, what information is available, and when we can start increasing that fidelity of the information, that more accuracy and more alignment with the ambitious gold standards like we expect this BSI one to be.
Thanks, Peter. That's really helpful. And I think there is an element of our objective right now is to agree in this standard on the set of rules. It is then up to individual stakeholder groups about how they use this standard and implement it in their own businesses, whether that's manufacturers or academics or procurers and payers. A couple other questions. One around, is there a similar effort happening for medical devices? It's a really good question, and a hypothesis we laid out about 12 months ago was around the same challenge. The issue really with medical devices is the category of products. That it is not universally defined to be able to set product category rules. There has been recently a harmonization of within the WHO related to product categories within the medical device arena. So there is a consideration, is that now something that could be used as the basis for a standard, a similar standard in the medical device arena? But I think the challenge first was product categories in medical devices and an aligned view of that. And then the second is the volume of products that are in the medical devices arena, that compared to the medicines, it is significantly a much longer tail of products. So the task to actually set product category rules would be much greater. So I think there is a view that to try to see the feasibility, because the need is the same, and but the challenge to do so is a much bigger task. So we had agreed at this stage to try to understand the viability of this project being successful, to then pass the learnings on to see how and where it could apply to the medical devices sector. I think the other question that's come through around time spent to implement this standard, or any expectations of how long it would take to implement. We don't have a very clear picture of that to answer the question very directly, but what I will say is, in the apps, because there has not been these rules in place before, it will be faster over time for businesses to be able to achieve environmental impact comparisons between the different planetary boundaries across a medicine life cycle now, because these rules are in place. Before, they didn't exist. And so to actually carry out this life cycle assessment took an extremely long period of time and was arduous, and still is right now. So I think whilst it may take a while for businesses to take this on and embed it in their businesses, the long-term viability of shortening that time to get to a life cycle assessment will be accelerated because of this standard being in place. So there's a balance there of, maybe in the short term, it may take a while for businesses to get to grips with these rules and embed it in their businesses. Hence, when we're talking to some of the payers and procurers, they have said there will be a period of time before the standard goes live, or once the standard goes live, to make it a requirement to give manufacturers time to implement this. There's another question in here, and I think it was, again, a good one, around the type of expertise to triangulate the planetary boundaries and the results there. So I will say that in the discussion forums and in the digital hub, we have over 300 people now represented, give or take, from across the different stakeholder groups in this digital hub, trying to feed into the discussion forums. There hasn't been a qualification, you have to have X expertise in order to be a part of this digital hub, to answer the question very directly. But I will say that when I have reviewed the stakeholders that have been involved, they are all involved in this challenge right here that we're all talking about. So that means that they will have varying technical degrees of what does land use mean, or resource use for fossils versus resource use for materials and metals. There may be differing understandings of the different planetary boundaries and the expertise that's required there, but they're all aware of the environmental impact areas that are ultimately being asked of medicine. So I think I will answer the question in that way.
Courtney, I'll hop in and answer one of these, and then you can get to the last one, just to give you a bit of a rest. So yeah, just to add to what Courtney was saying, I guess, we do, while we haven't directly triangulated some of that feedback that we received through the hub, the reality is that a lot of similar perspectives are represented on the steering group, and that was our intention in building such a diverse steering group. And so we have been able to delve quite deeply into some perspectives, and some, quite differing perspectives on the issue, for example, of impact categories, through our steering group membership. So that representation and that debate, it goes on, within the steering group, as well as within the wider context of the discussion forum. And we'll see where we land by public consultation, but even at that point, that might not be set in stone, and we will be interested to hear your feedback. In terms of whether there is an intention for PAS 2090 to be developed into an ISO, the relationship between PASs and ISOs is not necessarily at the discretion of the sponsors or an individual manager within the team. It really lies with ISO and their curiosity, and we can potentially submit a proposal. I think part of that question is around the maturity of the standard and what the appetite is there, but it's definitely an option that we would consider exploring. Courtney?
And I was just going to say, and we've done the work at the front end. One of the requirements is that at least 5 geographies are represented on the steering group of representation, and we've done that to make sure that if it were to take the ISO route, it would have the credibility at the forefront. And approximately 30% of PASs do go to the ISO route, so there is a known well-trodden path to take it to that level. But I will also say there are PASs that in their own right are internationally applicable, and for now, I would say this one is, and can be taken to ISO level as a subsequent stage, but it's not a requirement for it to be internationally applicable. So I think I'm going to honor everyone's time. We're at the top of the hour. I will also echo Flora's thanks on joining the other link, and thank you for your questions. Really great discussion at the end. If you have any more, please do participate in the discussion forum on the Digital Hub. We'll keep those open for the next couple weeks. And also remember, there's a manufacturer specific webinar again on the 24th of February. I'll make sure that that's posted in the Digital Hub for everyone to register if they feel inclined. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.